My name is Papa Kujobotio, and I will be your moderator for today's first plenary session. Today we have a high-level panel on the topic Education at the Brink of Collapse, Finding Sustainable Funding to Protect Education. On this high-level panel, we have a spectrum of speakers, experts, really from across the world on the topic of education access and also sustainable financing in education. To introduce myself, my name is Papa Kujobotio. I'm the former president of the Oxford University Africa Society, and I'm also a PhD student in comparative and international education here at the University of Oxford. So we started a few minutes late, so we're going to run through things. We have an hour in this session, and each speaker will give a 5 to 7 minute presentation on the topic Education at the Brink of Collapse, Finding Sustainable Funding to Protect Education. And I will run through the order of the presentation. So each speaker will be called forth and will give a short introduction of themselves instead of I giving the introduction, and then we'll go ahead and deliver their 5 to 7 minute speech. After all the speakers have spoken, about 8 of them, we will quickly summarize in about a minute and then open the floor to the speakers to give some reflections on the different perspectives that their colleagues have shared. So to begin with, I would like to invite Mr. Hugh McLean, who will be given the first presentation for today. Mr. McLean will introduce
I'm talking, of course, about Africa's 3 highest mountains, and the only ones that are above 5,000 meters. Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Mount Kenya in Kenya, of course, and Mount Rwenzori on the border of DRC and Uganda. As dangerous and high as they are, I'd like to speak about them because people have climbed them. So what are the mountains we need to climb in the virtual room, every discussion in this plenary? Well, we've been invited to consider education on the brink of collapse and finding sustainable financing power to protect education. This suggests to me at least 3 equally high summits to scale. I'm calling these Mount Struggle for Democracy, Mount Debt, and Mount Climate Change. These are the 3 summits that I believe will be in every virtual room of this summit. And like elephants in the room, they're going to be there whether we speak about them or not. So our first mountain then, Mount Struggle for Democracy, aka the question of political power. The BTI Transformation Index Bertelsmann of 2020, looking from 2017 to 2019, comes to the grand conclusion for Africa that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So it might be true that the transitions we saw in Angola in 2017, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe in 2018, Sudan 2019 brought very little actual change. Less true perhaps for Ethiopia, although we need to be watching the Tigray war. But in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic really began to give us a glimpse, I think, of the nature of African democracies. Zimbabwe and Uganda, as we've seen, using the pandemic as ways of clamping down on the opposition. And there were shootings and killings to enforce lockdowns in Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. And I heard of some in South Africa. And as we watched the spectacle of the US election results and President Trump behaving badly, Tanzania, Guinea, and Ivory Coast are simmering in the aftermath of their elections. Senegal, I have to say, set what I believe was a world-leading example, following science and consulting with teachers' unions during the early months of the pandemic. All these events show us that democracy is something we can never take for granted and that we have to fight to preserve it. We're also seeing ongoing conflicts in the Sahel from jihadist organizations and their hallmark attacks on education, and worrying developments in Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique. I mentioned the Tigray conflict, and of course, Somalia continues its decades-long civil war. Our second mountain then is Mount Finance, which, like Mount Kenya, has at least 3 peaks: debt, terms of world trade, poverty and inequality. The Institute of Health and Metrics and Evaluation from Washington University estimates that extreme poverty went up 7% in just the first few months of COVID-19 in Africa. This tragically ended what was an unbroken 20-year-on-year trend towards poverty alleviation. The World Bank projects that at least 43 million people in Africa are now at risk of severe poverty as a result of the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic. And the IMF predicts that between now and 2023, Africa faces a 1.2 trillion in financing needs, and of this, 410 billion at least will go to paying off debts. Foreign debts by 2023. We must expect this to put huge pressure on budgets for health and education, particularly, but all budgets. Our third mountain is Mount Climate Change. Africa's taken great steps to drive and implement the global climate agenda. Very high levels of ratification of the Paris Agreement. Over 90% of governments have signed, and they've also promised to go green in a relatively short time frame. These are good intentions, but they're sure to be disrupted by the economic fallout in the post-COVID phase. In terms of the real indicators, what we're seeing is continuing rising temperatures. 2019 was the warmest on record for Africa. We can expect a lot less rainfall in southwest Africa and in the north, and education. The first is how to build ASU's membership and its internal democracy, and how to, that means identify and bring in new members. Secondly, how to build alliances, particularly with teachers' unions in Africa, to find your common causes, to share your struggles, and to look forward the victories that you will win together. And lastly, the thing I think that's going to be important is how ASU can take a confident lead and find and offer solidarity in the student movement globally through your membership of the Global Student Forum, but also the other alliances that you build. So these are the mountains that I believe we need to climb now in the summit, and that we will have to scale between this and your next summit. And I look forward to your leadership in this period, and I salute your leadership for your efforts. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hugh McLean, and thank you for that very descriptive metaphor that you've used to describe the different challenges that we have. Finding sustainable funding to protect education is important, but there's so many different mountains that we have to climb to their summits during this particular pandemic and even beyond. Thank you for that submission, and we'll have the rest of the panelists react to that later and add on to the perspectives that you have shared. Next, we have Mr. Guangzhou Chan.
Number is in addition to so many millions the children and youth already out of school before the crisis. The largest share of learners at risk of not returning to school after are projected to be in South and West Asia, as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa. So UNESCO has been developing some programs to support countries in their efforts to mitigate the immediate impact of school closures. In March 2020, it launched the Global Education Coalition as a platform for international solidarity and innovative solutions to protect the right to education during this period. So I'm proud to count AASU, All Africa Students Union, among the members of this coalition. However, a huge disruption has been caused to the educational settings, while all students will need support to make up for lost time and learning. The crisis has particularly affected the most disadvantaged groups of population. So education systems around the world, regardless of their income level, had entered into crisis without being prepared. We need to build back better and strengthen the resilience of education systems. But this requires funding. Yet the COVID-19 pandemic affected the world economy like never before. Economic activity came to abrupt halt and a sharp recession with a detrimental effect on public revenue, raising capacity and budget allocations. I think other colleagues, speakers will talk about it. So amid these challenges, government reacted swiftly, making massive fiscal measures during this period to save lives and protect workers and their families. And according to by mid-September 2020, the world has deployed massive stimulus packages of some 12 trillion US dollars or even more. Despite this huge disruption caused to the education system by the crisis, the education sector has been largely invisible in their fiscal responses, with less than 1% globally allocated to education. So may I remind that the financing gap for achieving SDG 4 in the world's poorest countries has been already high before the crisis. And COVID-19 is piling up additional costs on education, already facing a huge challenge in the efforts to achieve SDG 4. Developing countries now have to contend with additional challenges, just like the richest countries. At the same time, you have seen countries, some promising examples where governments have committed to leverage the power of education and training as key investment not only for ensuring a robust economic recovery, but also for sustainable, inclusive green transformation of the economy. So UNESCO, I'd like to repeat that the UNESCO advocates for protecting education investment during this period and beyond as a strategy to fulfill the right to education for all, especially for the most vulnerable populations, as well as an efficient, effective, and sustainable economic recovery strategy. This year, 2020, and this month, particularly December, marks the 60th anniversary of the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, and we unfortunately witnessed that the COVID-19 has widened the pre-existing pre-crisis disparities and inequalities in education. So what we would suggest, invite governments and their developed partners to protect education in their financing and prioritize some enabling areas for achieving SDG 4 and other SDGs, such as providing direct and targeted support to the most vulnerable populations in order to mitigate massive numbers of children and youth at risk of not returning to school. And the international aid must also prioritize countries most in need of support. And government will need to develop and implement education and training policies that equip youth with the relevant skills towards an inclusive and green recovery and structural transformation of the economy. And also, we know that the crisis has revealed the weakness of our traditional education systems. So strengthening education system will require investment, possibly high in the short term, but with the longer term benefits to strengthen the resilience of education systems. No one country or one organization can solve these problems alone. The COVID-19 education crisis taught us that we can work together to face the common challenges, and youth can play a critical role in this endeavor. Youth is not the future only, you are the present. You can make a difference by mobilizing international solidarity, working out innovative solutions, and acting to deliver results. So I believe that this platform of dialogue provides a great avenue for discussing ideas and exploring actions that are needed to secure sustainable funding for education and to build back better. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guangchou Chang. There are three things that I took from your speech, and that is the efforts that UNESCO is making to partner to mitigate the impact of school closures, that the financing gap for SDG 4 has still not been met, and also there are massive numbers of children and youth who are at risk of not returning to school. From the rest of the panelists, we'll hear different perspectives. And the next speaker, Ms. Erica Miranda Gomez, is an expert and is the president of the College Sports Association in Cape Verde, and she will introduce herself and give her presentation now. Thank you.
Obrigada. O meu nome é Erica Miranda, sou presidente da Federação de Estudantes aqui em Cabo Verde. Agradeço à SU pela oportunidade de estar aqui presente e partilhar convosco um bocado daquilo que foi a experiência de Cabo Verde nessa pandemia de Covid-19. Ouvi dizer que em África do Sul, numa universidade, existe uma placa onde dizia que para destruir uma nação não era necessário ter bombas a longa distância ou iniciar uma guerra, que basta fazer com que a educação permitisse aos estudantes copiassem e diminuísse a qualidade de educação. Caso isso acontecesse, e os formados não seriam pessoas com qualidades. Os médicos pacientes iriam perder vidas nas mãos desses médicos, edifícios iriam se arrombar todos por causa desses engenheiros. Isso para dizer que o colapso da educação é o colapso de todo um sistema, de uma nação. E o que é que se viu-se durante essa pandemia? Durante essa pandemia, vimos o sistema educacional a entrar sem colapso. O que ainda não tínhamos assistido, pelo menos numa perspectiva tão rápida, num espaço tão curto de tempo. Assistimos em março as universidades a fecharem as portas. E mesmo que as universidades fecham as portas, nós sabemos que o processo de ensino e aprendizagem ele não pode parar, tem que ser algo contínuo. E o que aconteceu em Cabo Verde foi o seguinte: o governo implementou um conjunto de medidas para minimizar todos os efeitos da pandemia. Melhorou-se a condição da internet, arranjou-se televisores para o sistema de ensino à distância, ofereceu-se computadores, mas o que foi uma grande valia, e eu queria partilhar aqui convosco, é que durante os 3 meses de pandemia, em que os nossos estudantes não tivemos aula, o governo reduziu a propina por 50%. Nós aqui só pagamos metade daquilo que era suposto pagar durante esses 3 meses. Isso fez com que milhares de estudantes não abandonassem o ensino. E pensar de uma forma sustentável de fazer com que a educação não entre em colapso tem que ser um processo tripartidário, uma pirâmide entre os estudantes, o governo e toda a sociedade civil. Existe uma necessidade de pensarmos, de agirmos de forma concreta para que o sistema não entre em colapso. É claro que nós não temos todas as soluções necessárias, mas eu acredito, se congregarmos, se unirmos e pensarmos a nível global e agirmos localmente, encontraremos as soluções, porque nós estamos vivendo um tempo difícil, e tempo difícil trazem homens mais fortes. É necessário ter uma união, mesmo a fundo, pensar isso mesmo a fundo e encontrar todas as soluções possíveis. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Ms. Miranda. Thank you very much. Next, we have a presentation from Mr. Mod A. Seka. So Mr. Mod Seka will introduce himself, but briefly, he's the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Higher Education, Research, Science and Technology in the Gambia. You're welcome, Mr. Mod A. Seka.
Yes, thank you. Like you said, my name is Mod A. Seka, and I'm also very happy to be invited to such a discussion because it's very topical. Education at the brink of collapse, finding sustainable funding to protect education. I will basically speak within the experience of the Gambia. As you know, when COVID struck sometime around February, it caught all of us unawares. Just to give you a quick synopsis of what happened. In the Gambia, as you know, we operate our budget on a calendar year. So this issue of COVID was never anticipated, even in the national budget. And when the virus struck and there was lockdown, the first priority for government was accorded to the health sector. So meaning all the resources that were available at the time that could be reallocated were dedicated to the health sector. Then leaving the education and other sectors to be second or maybe third in priority based on what you want to, classify. So in essence, we had to come up with some innovative way of supporting our institutions so that online lectures can happen and then students will not lose a whole year. And so luckily we were able to succeed in making sure that at least they completed their lessons as well as did their exams. So we've not lost the year as such. And what have we done? Essentially, we started by first trying to come up with some support for the institutions. You have some subvented institutions that are partially funded by government. So we gave them some additional money to make sure they also enhance their IT capabilities, as well as give some support to lecturers so that they can also prepare their lessons and post them online. In addition to that also, we initiated some discussions with the GSM operators, that's the telecommunication sector. And they were willing to open up free sites for the educational sector, especially higher educational sector. So they gave free megabytes, but then also there were some challenges of, because the students were scattered all over the country at that time, because you will expect that naturally if lectures are not happening, they will be traveling to their respective families. So you had instances where network connectivity and all those things were challenges, and government had to give them some allowance for airtime so that they can also follow the lectures. Now, finally, I think in terms of institutional support also, what we did was the Tibet institutions, particularly when it was time to reopen, we are in fact in a very serious financial distress because they've not been collecting their fees, students were not attending, and they are not getting government support either. So we try to also support them by giving them basic PPEs so that it can facilitate their how to call it, reopening. And that was also successfully done. However, we had also made a request on their behalf to government, which is yet to be honored. But I can say from the discussion we had with them, they are virtually in a financial distress, all of them. Some of them even expressing the threat of being closed on a permanent basis if nothing is forthcoming. Now, then we also have a peculiar case in the Gambia where you have a large number of students outside the country being either sponsored by government or by parents. But because at the time parents were also not working, some of them were having problem even getting remittances to their respective students abroad, their respective kids abroad. So the government came up with a relief package of a flat $300 per student who are not sponsored by the government, residing anywhere in the world and doing their studies. In addition to that also, because we also received complaint during the lockdown that because the students were unable to go out and do anything, they cannot get monies to even sustain themselves. So we also initiated sending those who were sponsored by the government their stipends at an early stage so that they can also get liquidity to manage their way through this pandemic. Now, after all these things, one of the key lessons we have learned is that, like I said earlier on, the pandemic caught us unawares, all of us. And if you look at the relative investments in higher education sector relating to IT, to deliver online lectures and the like, in the case of the Gambia, we had different story. Whilst the University of the Gambia was relatively ready to, transfer to an online program, all the other higher education institutions and Tibet institutions had very little investments in this area. So it took longer time for them to adopt and deliver their lectures respectively. And then this brings me to a very important point, which I think is very necessary. I think COVID or no COVID, we should also prepare a business continuity plan for the education sector. Because if you don't have a business continuity plan, what it means is if you have a similar incident like COVID, it means you are going back to lockdown again. So if you have a business continuity plan, you would have assessed the relative strengths and weaknesses of IT systems in different institutions, how you intend to upgrade them so that when you want to deliver online lectures, it's possible. The other thing that we have learned is that it looks like blended learning is here to stay. I mean, the experience we have is that you might not want to be caught unawares. And I think some of these lectures can also be posted online so that the students can also benefit from that. As a result of all this the ministry is also working on a transformative strategic plan where some of the key institutions will be transformed. For instance, a case in point is the Gambia Technical Training Institute, which we are trying to transform into University of Science, Engineering, and Technology. The essence of this transformation is to focus on entrepreneurship at the end of the day. As you know, probably for those of you who are not familiar with Gambia, bulk of our skills are from other countries, which means there is a big gap. So we are trying to address that gap in this process. So in conclusion, I would just say that thank the students for this kind of initiative, and also to urge them to build on their alliance and be heard in all national and international fora where resources are being allocated. I think in some of our countries, education is still not given the priority it deserves. But if we are to move ahead, you cannot ignore education. It should be at the forefront in terms of being allocated resources and policies. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mod Seka. From your speech, you mentioned that blended learning is here to stay. It looks like that indeed is the case. And you know, your point about partnerships with the telcos to mitigate some of those costs is very important. It looks like a number of governments in Africa had to, you know, fall back on that option as an emergency fix to the situation. And I hope that as we draw business continuity plans, we have long-term plans on how we can ensure that, you know, accessibility to IT resources and the internet is a mainstay really, and that in case of another pandemic, we wouldn't be scuttling to find solutions like what has just happened in the last few months. Next, I would like to invite Mr. David Archer to give his presentation. Mr. David Archer is the Head of Participation and Public Services at Action Aid. You're welcome, Mr. Archer.
Thank you very much. And I much appreciate being invited to this space. And I'm going to focus my energies on talking about that biggest mountain of them all, as Hugh would have it, Mount Finance, because it does seem to me that everything depends on sorting out the finances. And when we're talking about finances, there is going to be a terrible shock to public finances across the world, in fact. As a result of COVID, there'll be falling GDPs, falling tax revenues, and therefore gaps in public service budgets, unless action is taken, and action needs to be taken now, and it's needed urgently. And quite frankly, it's not about building back better, but building in I think, a feminist transformative manner, seizing the moment of this COVID crisis to really put an end to 40 years of neoliberal, patriarchal market fundamentalism, and to put forward green, progressive, feminist alternatives. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the money is not there to transform public education and all other public services across Africa. The money is there. It's about political choices, and it's about the pressure the governments feel from their citizens, and the most powerful voices in many cases will be young people and students holding their government to account, demanding a change from so many years of dysfunctional failure to invest in quality public education and public services. A couple of months ago, 190 organizations signed on to a call for action on sustainable financing of education post-COVID, focusing on domestic financing. And I'm going to say a few things about the big recommendations that come from that call to action. First of all, look, there's loads of money in every country to pay for public services. It's sitting there, but it gets taken away before anything can be considered to be spent on public services by the need to service debts. And unless there is a massive new round of debt cancellation and radical debt renegotiation, is going to be, we're not going to make the sort of progress that we need. There is some movement on this from the G20 and from, but it's much too little and not on the scale of ambition that's needed. We estimate any country that's spending over 12% of its national budget on servicing debt ends up cutting public spending. And so we need to look at drawing a line and making sure all future loans are taken out in a transparent and accountable way, because at the moment loans are taken out without that proper oversight and revenue is often not wisely invested. Companies, Google, Facebook and Microsoft, if they were made to pay fair tax in the countries where they make a profit, 850,000 more teachers could be employed across 20 countries. That is where the big revenue lies. Expand tax bases and tax revenues in a progressive way, and you'll see a transformation, not just in financing for education, but in health, in water, and in other essential public services. This is a win-win situation where everyone can rise with the tide. But none of that will make a difference unless countries detach themselves from their dependency on the International Monetary Fund that is still absolutely attached to a market fundamentalism and a belief in austerity. In exchange for the apparently very generous loans the IMF has given out in the COVID emergency loans, countries have had to commit to reducing or returning to fiscal consolidation within the next year. Fiscal consolidation is the IMF term for austerity. Every country that has taken an IMF loan will be under massive pressure to reimpose austerity next year unless there's a collective resistance. And there will be particularly constraints on public sector wages, as we have already seen in many countries. This is significant for young people because a lot of young people are frontline workers in health, in education, in other public services. And if we don't actually, if there's a squeeze in the financing for public services, that will be an end to so many economic opportunities and decent work for young people. There's a lot more in that call to action. We certainly need to still fight for more aid, more harmonized aid, and aid that comes without ideologically driven conditions. But there is a clear agenda for transforming financing of public services. Most countries across Africa should be doubling their spending on education and on health and on other public services. It can be done. It's about political choices. It's about economic choices. It's about ending this 40 years of chronic underfunding under neoliberalism. And I think that everyone needs to be part of that struggle right now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. David Archer. And just going off your last point, you know, I have just read in a May 2020 World Bank paper that public spending on education is actually going down during this pandemic. And the projections are also lower because they are based on GDP outputs per country. So what you're saying about expanding tax bases and also massive debt forgiveness is really important. Otherwise, countries will not be able to bridge that gap to actually double spending on education. So we hope to see how you know, these loan forgiveness programs and other, versatile ways of increasing these tax bases and GDP outputs will be channeled towards education, especially as this conversation is, trying to center. So next we have Dr. Graham Atherton. Dr. Graham Atherton is the director of the National Education Opportunities Network in the UK, and he will be giving his presentation now. You're welcome, Dr. Graham Atherton.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you again for inviting me today to speak this event at the Africa Students News Summit. As we said there, my role is in the UK predominantly, but I also convene an initiative called World Access to Higher Education Day, and the All Africa Students Union were kind enough to be engaged in the third World Access to Higher Education Day, or WAHED, which only occurred 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to focus really my remarks specifically in the area which I undertake most of my work, which is in the area of higher education or university education, and look again at this issue of the roundtable, looking at finding sustainable funding to protect education. I'd like to say as well that particularly, I probably agree with everything I've heard today, particularly from the last speaker. And I guess in the context of my remarks, they're a little more focused, but they certainly exist in the spirit of what's been said in the event so far. So anyway, the extent of disruption caused to global education and higher education systems by the pandemic can hardly be underestimated. Research by the World Bank suggests that in April this year, universities and tertiary education institutions were closed in 175 countries. Over 220 million post-secondary students had their studies significantly disrupted due to COVID-19. In economic terms, the impact of the pandemic on higher education is huge, and has pushed some institutions into insolvency. The impact on those wishing to enter learning from low-income and other marginalised backgrounds will be the greatest, more likely widening the gaps that already exist between these groups and their wealthier counterparts. Research which I led myself in 2016, looking at participation in higher education across the world by social background, shows that in all of the countries of the world where we have evidence, that's over 90% participation is unequal. Inequities in university systems is a challenge that transcends both rich and poor countries. It's not the case that, okay, it may be different in scope and scale, and it's more pronounced in poorer countries. Overall enrolment is far lower. In sub-Saharan Africa, enrolment in tertiary education at 9%, as opposed to nearly 70% in Europe. The economic impact of the pandemic, coupled with a shift to online learning in a context where digital access amongst low-income communities is extremely limited, implies that these inequalities are likely to be exacerbated by the pandemic. Addressing these inequalities and protecting the funding required to stop rising inequality and might improve the pre-pandemic situation will be a huge challenge. I think it was mentioned earlier on, if we look at where donor aid is concerned for education, overall, research by UNESCO showed in 2010, aid to education reached its highest level since records on disbursement were established in 2002. But it then decreased in 2011-12, and only slowly recovered since then. Between 2014-15, aid to education grew by $500 million to reach $12 billion US, but still 4% below its 2010 level. So the point is, it's hardly the case that was made by the last speaker that we were addressing these inequalities significantly before the pandemic. Thus, the situation was even more striking and urgent now. But I think we need to look at raising the importance of education to donors and, more importantly, to regional and national governments, where advocacy is crucial. Advocacy, though, requires evidence. This is where big gaps exist. We look at the situation where higher education is concerned. In many countries, in both the developed, both in Africa and across other parts of the world, information on which groups go to university, which are not attending, which are being missed out, is not collected. Nor is the data on the benefits of higher education collected as extensive as it should be. The benefits of individuals and society. Such data has to be quantitative, but also can be qualitative. The stories of students who have succeeded and those who should have but opportunities denied them can wield great political capital if deployed correctly. Without this data in a range of forms, and the case for education cannot be made. Education is the ultimate enabler. It unlocks improvements in health, in the economy, and the well-being of our societies. But I'm not convinced this story is still being told properly, particularly in higher education. Despite working in what is a data-rich environment, we do not deploy this kind of data effectively enough. Better data is not the only ingredient, though, to better advocacy. What is it, for instance, we should be advocating for? The goals here vary across countries and across contexts. A fundamental goal, though, that transcends boundaries should be a right to education through life and for everyone. Where higher education is concerned, it is noticeable when rights to higher education for certain minority groups were extended in particular countries, such as Brazil, for instance, participation levels increased. A rights-based approach has the potential to significantly shift the debate regarding education funding at a post-secondary level. The pandemic has created a need and opportunity of reflection on what is and should be prioritised. In this reflection, the case for lifelong rights to education must be articulated. The question of how this will be paid for will inevitably come next. However, as the previous speaker emphasised, these are political choices. Resources will always exist to some degree, whether in or outside countries. The deployment of these resources be towards education, and arguments must coalesce around a straightforward and bold proposition. Gradualism in a crisis context, allowing the appeal of pragmatism and hence being some seen as lower risk, may indeed also have a present greater risk. Partial arguments for education are not sufficient when other voices, talking about limited resources, calls on government, other needs to fund other activities will be loud and vociferous. Being heard is essential. The final area which attention must focus if funding is to be secured in any way is collaboration and alliance building within and across sectors and countries. In higher education, the extent of political collaboration is far too low, and consequently, in the competition for resources, it suffers. The organisations that endeavour to present the coherent sector-wide case for funding and support, be that within countries or be that across continents, do this at a minimum level of resource with tiny numbers of staff relative to the sector they try and represent. Universities that spend millions of dollars a year will balk at spending more than a few thousand on joining a regional or national body. They're the first to go when it comes to cost cutting. Many, especially old and more powerful institutions, feel they're better served presenting their own interests first. Such endemic myopia will ultimately be self-defeating, open the door for low cost and low quality post-secondary education, attractive to policymakers because it's cheap, but not benefiting students. Perhaps by necessity really being a mother of invention here, new coalitions will be formed. The initiative I mentioned earlier on, World Access to Higher Education Day, or WAHED, is a new form of coalition. It brings together students, universities, funders, and NGOs to advocate for a change in equitable access to higher education. Yet it's being delivered with virtually no resources, with 2 or 3 staff started here in London. Why is that the case? Why has nobody else done World Access to Higher Education Day before? Why does nobody else set up and put a little bit of resource, relative resource, into something to focus on the thing that brings universities together across the world? And it's not knowledge and learning, it's inequality. But its limited impact does at least show that to leave more resource into higher and tertiary education, and international collaboration is essential. Students have a critical role to play in taking forward the 3 actions above. They can drive data collection themselves with collective action, and the best place to call for a right to learn, as they have the boldness of thought that those worn down by years in the system find it harder to utilise. Through imagination and collaboration, such as what we're seeing today with this fantastic summit and event and the partners here, that's the pressure on universities to reimagine how they see their own self-interest. It's hard to downplay the scale of the task we face, reversing education inequality, especially in higher education, securing the funding to do this. But if it represents anything, education, and especially our students, should represent hope. We cannot afford to lose this hope. Not now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atherton. As a researcher in rural disadvantage and access to higher education, I was just nodding throughout at everything that you were saying. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of data collection and very sound policy moves that do not just consider cheap solutions, but sustainable solutions. It's up to all of us to form those coalitions that will ensure that we have sustainable solutions to education and digital inclusion, and not just, temporary solutions that we have at this moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Coach.
Next, we have Ms. Kyra Bo, and she will be giving her presentation next. Ms. Kyra Bo is the education lead at Oxfam. You're welcome, Ms. Kyra Bo.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And thank you to all of you working so hard to make this 9th Africa Student and Youth Summit happen in this challenging time for all of us. My name is Kyra Bo, as it was just mentioned. I'm the education policy lead for Oxfam, and I'm based in Copenhagen, Denmark, which is why it's very dark around me, because it's we're getting close to the shortest days of the year. So the world is in a state of crisis. Education is in a state of crisis. Decades of gain in education access, completion, quality may very well be swept aside due to COVID-19, both the COVID-related school closures, but also the economic crisis that is already beginning to impact countries around the world, including in Africa. COVID is not just a health crisis or an education crisis, though. It is also an inequality crisis. Children of the wealthiest have had online teaching through the school closures. They've had access to private tutors, close virtual contact with their teachers. The children of the poorest have had none of that. This is a lost year, and many, mainly girls, will never again enter a schoolroom. When we talk about this, it sounds like we may just be talking about the poorest countries in the world, but in fact, this is the case for many countries, including my own. Maybe not that children won't come back to school, but that there is a vast disparity between how the wealthy or the children of the wealthy have done through this crisis and how the children of poorer families. My country is one of the countries in the world with the best access to internet, and yet access to internet is a reason why about 15% of children have not had proper access to homeschooling through the school closures in the first few months of the crisis. So while this is a crisis, I don't want us to be defeated. It is a crisis that we have some power over ourselves. Hugh talked in his intervention about these 3 mountains. So to stay in that metaphor, we have the mountain climbing gear that we need. And the question is whether we're willing to put in the effort needed to scale those mountains. We can impact the decisions that are being made right now in governments and multilateral institutions around the world. These are decisions about budget, about investments, about what is important, about what to prioritize. And obviously, sitting in this room, we all agree that there's nothing that could be more important than education. We know that education is not only the silver bullet for economic prosperity for the individual. Education can make societies more equal, more democratic, more resilient to challenges such as COVID-19 in the future, but also other challenges. It also makes societies healthier and more prosperous. But that requires that governments and those in power see that value. And that's where you all and we all have a role to play. We have to convince them. We have to make them see how vital it is that education budgets are not cut due to economic austerity measures or due to debt servicing, as several have mentioned. We have to make politicians in donor countries see that now is not the time to cut aid budgets, as we're already seeing countries do, particularly the UK and the announcement that they have made over the last few weeks. And we have to make those in power and the huge multilateral institutions see that cuts to healthcare and education is not how you bring countries out of an economic crisis. We have a voice and we have a role to play in convincing them of that, those in power. So in Oxfam, we work with allies and partners in fighting the global structures that push countries to cut education budgets. We want true debt relief. We work every day to create global tax bodies that can ensure that money earned in African countries is taxed in those countries and that tax havens are abolished. We want progressive taxation, yes. But that's not enough, because even if money stayed in the country, there's no guarantee that it will actually be spent on the right things. So we don't just need aid. We don't just need debt relief. We don't just need progressive taxation. We do need all of those, but we also need progressive spending. And yes, education is the best way to spend your money, but education is not simply education. Or maybe put a different way, all education is not equal. So not only does Oxfam's and allies and partners have to use all our power to fight cuts to education, we also have to fight for education budgets and the money to education set aside by countries and by donors to go to the places and people where the money will do the most good. That's in good, quality, free, public education for all, not private education for the few. So there are fights yet to be won, but you already have the tools. We know this. So thank you again for the invitation to speak to you, and congratulations on all that you do.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bo. And thank you for highlighting again and reminding us that the goal should be good quality public education for all and not private education for the few. It's quite sad to reflect and realize that this may be a lost year for a lot of people, and with the way learning is going this year, with blended learning and even homeschooling, it is possible that so many people may not go back to school ever again, because there's a new option that we are all exposed to, and whatever that option is must be developed to its fullest potential. Next, we have Mr. Dennis Signolo. Mr. Signolo is the Chief Regional Coordinator for Africa for Education International. Let's welcome Mr. Dennis Signolo to give us the final presentation of this high-level roundtable. You're welcome, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. As already indicated, yes, I'm from Education International, which is the Global Federation of Teacher Unions. We represent 32.5 million educators in 178 countries, from early childhood to tertiary education. I would like to thank the All Africa Students Union for inviting EI to this important summit. As educators and students, we share a specific symbiotic relationship. That is the reason why we have been asking UNESCO to recognize and declare the student-teacher relationship as intangible cultural or world heritage. We hope to make progress and have that relationship recognized by the United Nations soon. Colleagues, as already pointed out by the other speakers, education is at the crossroads, mainly because of long-standing challenges which have been laid bare by the current COVID-19 crisis. Just to recall that even before the current crisis, Sustainable Development Goal for Quality Education and the objectives of the Continental Education Strategy for Africa were already off track. We launched a report at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2019, and in that report, the biggest bottleneck to achieving SDG goals by 2030 is lack of education financing and inadequate investment in teachers at all levels of education. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a serious impact on students, teachers, and education systems. EI Africa's most recent study on the impact of COVID-19 on education shows that distance education programs provided during COVID-19 have not been effective. Over 80% of the teacher union respondents from 34 African countries consider the e-learning measures taken by governments to be ineffective, mainly because of challenges related to digital infrastructure and connectivity. Teachers lack the necessary training and support for them to be able to deliver effective online teaching and learning. Furthermore, data costs are very high and unaffordable to many educators, students, and families. That is why Education International is calling on the African Union and African governments to regulate data costs. Unless data costs are regulated and digital infrastructure is made universal and accessible to all, distance education and e-learning will remain a pipe dream for the vast majority of our children and youth. COVID-19 has given rise to widening inequalities and exclusion. Rural children, girls, children with disabilities, refugees and migrants are being left behind. Overall, children in developing countries and in Africa in particular are being left far behind because of the digital divide and long-standing problems bedeviling our country's education systems. EI is calling on governments to carry out equity audits. We need to know who is being left behind, and we should target those groups of children and youth and get them to school and to remain there. Colleagues, the right to equitable, inclusive, quality education for all can only be achieved through strong public education systems. Relying on private actors to deliver education is not a sustainable solution. For example, results from the EI Africa study I cited earlier on show that teachers in private schools have either gone for months without pay or have been laid off. Some education institutions have been forced to close, and governments have had to take on those students at all levels of education. Education, as we know, is a fundamental human right and a public good. Governments have an obligation to ensure that this right is enjoyed by all children, youth, and adults. That is why we need strong public education systems and well-funded public schools, colleges, and universities. African governments need to adhere to agreed international benchmarks for financing education by allocating at least 20% of their national budget or at least 6% of their country's GDP to education. This is a commitment they have already made. But the problem is, according to UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, African governments are currently investing 16.8% of total public spending, not 20, and 4.4% of GDP, not 6. So we need to push through advocacy, mobilization, and action so that they invest more in education and allocate it equitably across the different levels. Increasing the overall size of the budget, as David Archer pointed out, is also fundamental. So we need to increase the tax to GDP ratio through progressive tax policies. We need to challenge tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax holidays, and corruption in our countries. In short, I would put it this way: the education cake is just too small. We need to grow the size of the cake so that the piece that we get as education is bigger and reasonable. Unfortunately, education budgets are under threat. We've just heard previously about the impact of international financial institutions, which continue to put caps on public spending. So we will continue to challenge that. Now, as teachers and as students, as teacher organizations and as student organizations, we need to join hands in defending and promoting quality public education for all. Protecting education budgets from cuts and calling for more investment in education should be our rallying cry moving forward. Students are not passive beneficiaries of education policies and programs, but change agents, the future of our communities, societies, and our very existence as humanity. As a key stakeholder, you should be consulted and be at the table when education policy decisions are made. Nothing for us without us. As we have been collaborating, as EI, we've been collaborating very well with students, particularly at global level. We will, in that regard, be hosting the Global Students Forum, which is a new grouping of all student unions in the world in our headquarters in Brussels. I believe we can cultivate the same deeper partnership and collaboration in Africa, and I look forward to meeting with your leaders in pursuit of that goal. Thank you once again for inviting us to be part of this important online conference. I wish you great success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Signolo, for your wonderful presentation. From your presentation, we've learned the importance of partnerships, the importance of increasing you know, the pot of financial support that we need for education, and also the importance of coalitions that has been earlier mentioned. And we are particularly excited to learn more about the Global Students Forum that will be held in your headquarters in Brussels, and how ASU and students in Africa as well can join this coalition to strengthen the push on larger education financing and efforts towards inclusivity in education. So I would like to thank all of our speakers for their presentations today. I think I would allow maybe just a minute or 2 minutes for any of our speakers to give us, you know, a summary or a reaction to some of the perspectives that we've heard here today. I feel like offering that to Mr. Hugh McLean, because he brought that first metaphor of the 3 summits to surmount, and you know, we've all run with it and really been able to paint the picture of what to really solve within this arena through the metaphor that he has shared. So, Mr. McLean, just to conclude.
Sure, I think I'm probably just as worried about the deep river valleys at the moment, and the deep gorges. They're going to be perilous, these mountains. And I think the thing about a mountain, you know, that if it's a very difficult and a very high mountain, you can't go up on your own. You need a lot of preparation along the way. You need the plan. You need people to come with you. You need good comrades. Those alliances that we spoke about, that Dennis spoke about, that David and Graham and others and Kairopo spoke about, are absolutely essential, and we need to build them very, very smartly for the fight ahead. It's going to take really targeted advocacy, I think, around aid and tax, and it's going to take a lot of pressure from the ground. I don't think there's an option to be doing one or the other. It's going to take a combined strategy with very smart and targeted advocacy and real power on the ground. And for that, we're going to need to rely on the strength of our membership-based organizations in the teachers' unions and in the student unions and civil society.
All right, thank you very much for those summative words. So we're already a good number of minutes behind time, and would like to go on to our various next sessions. So I'd like to thank you all, our viewers and audience, for joining us on this roundtable. My own perspectives have been deeply enriched by all that I've heard over here. Thank you all for representing government, civil society, your independent organizations, and preferring solutions to all the problems in education and financing that the COVID pandemic has only really highlighted. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest.